All right, welcome in everyone to tonight's webinar. My name is Adam and I'll be your moderator. Tonight we're joined by Eric and Matt from Cirrus Consulting Group. They will be highlighting top questions surrounding if you should relocate your practice or renegotiate your lease. At any point during the webinar, if you have questions, feel free to type them into the Q&A section of your control panel and we'll answer them live at the end. Henry Schein is not offering CE credit for viewing or attending this presentation live or on demand, and this webinar is sponsored by Cirrus Consulting. Eric and Matt, take it away.
Perfect. Thank you, Mr. Sweet. I wanted to take a quick moment as a bunch of people are logging in here after Turkey Day to really take a quick moment to recognize those behind the cameras, behind the scenes. I've had the privilege of doing almost 15 events with this individual who's been with Schein for now almost 5 years in July. And I did want to pass the mic and just to say a huge thank you to Mr. Adam Sweet and his team that have really provided some really fantastic content, has taken this whole concept of Dental Academy and the webinar series from an idea to being, some of the top content creation throughout the industry through this perilous past year and a half. So Adam, on behalf of all the different presenters across practice services and the entire One Shine spectrum, thank you, sir, for all you
Thank you. I appreciate that. Giving you a thumbs up emoji.
do. Sir. All right, as everyone's logging in, don't zoom and drive. We do have some great content up here and really a bit of a case study piece. We want to keep this very interactive. So use the chat as you can. You can certainly give a quick shout out there to let us know where you're coming from, what part of the country you're in, as well as some Q&A as we go. So we're doing a lot of situational, real world case study situational components that have come across our desk over the past year or two through this absolutely unbelievable time in our lives. But I wanted to kick things off with help to customize a little bit as well. We'll pull up a quick poll just to give us a little background of your situation. And we'll help to reference some specific examples and then talk about it as Matt and I run through some recent specific situations, how we navigated through it, and more so what the end results were. So first and foremost, number one, give us a little background in terms of what best describes your situation. Are you buying or building? Are you relocating? Are you looking to potentially acquire? Are you thinking of transitioning, right? Are you planning to stay put and renegotiate, right? Or none of the above? Also, from that perspective, some of your objectives, right? Obviously, this is pretty unique and hyper specialized. So tell us a little bit about specifically what you're thinking about. Talking to a doctor today, they're looking to open their second and or third location, which is a pretty unique time. If you've got that Rockefeller glass half full approach, should be, again, it's a pretty unique time that we've been able to secure doctors and help them facilitate that growth, let it be buy, build, expand, or beyond. In addition to that, again, based on your situation, helpful to give guidance based on your situation, based on the lease expiry. Do you have a lease today? Do you own your own building, right? Or do you have a lease? And if so, when does that expire? And also thinking about if you're planning to start or buy a practice, right? And then obviously there's been a lot of requests already in terms of those looking for some help, understanding what the current market is in their local location, as well as right, what that potential relocation might have to offer for you. And it's we're going to talk about some different strategies, such as how to have your cake and eat it too, as it pertains to your upcoming negotiations, and go through some examples. So I'm joined here with Matthew Donato. Matthew's one of our senior consultants on our healthcare leasing team at Cirrus. Matthew, thank you for joining us.
My pleasure. Thanks, Eric.
Matt does some great works throughout the Southeast, as well as throughout the continental US. And again, a great resource. Both himself, myself, and some of the rest of the team have spent probably thousands upon thousands of hours over the past year and a half talking to doctors just like yourselves, going through a lot of the strategy about what to do and when and how to do it. First of all, to start things off and mix things up, there's three key numbers to kick off. Number one is 85, 54, and 80. So what do these numbers mean? Well, based on our data, what we're showing, and this is since increased since COVID, that 85% of dentists have a lease that can prevent them from ever selling their practice, number one. Right. So what does that mean? In the assignment section of your lease, many doctors will be surprised to know that the landlord may not give them the ability to assign or transfer the lease. So for those of you following along in your lease, it's the assignment section that could, right, have a significant impact of that saleability. So number one. In addition to that, 54% of dentists across the continental US are overpaying in rent for their practice. Pretty self-explanatory, but many would be shocked to know that what's happened with rental rates, vacancy rates, months on market, that in some cases it's upwards of 18 months, meaning that if you were to leave your space and the landlord puts a for lease on average, in some markets, right, it can be upwards of 16, 17, 18 months, which is how long that landlord has to float that vacancy and eat that rent, all because you've left. So don't underestimate the power and the leverage that you have with the landlord. And last but not least, 80% of landlords structure their lease to give them a right to at least 50% of the practice sale proceeds. And this has only become more common through the pandemic, where landlords now are seeing the massive amount of values being sold 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 times EBITDA, right? And suddenly the landlord says, well, hang on a second, how much is your practice worth, right? Without my keys, without my location. Well, maybe it's my foot traffic now that is yielding the high amount of value to your practice. So again, as we touch on, should I renegotiate and stay, or should I contemplate expanding, relocating, etc.? As we're juggling between those two, you really want to think about what those long-term plans all the way through to eventual transitioning. All right. Again, for those of you that just joined, feel free to throw in some Q&A, and we're going to do a lot more case study. Keep things interactive this evening. Thanks again for joining us. For those of you that haven't heard of us before, we're unique. We're the only healthcare specialized tenant representation firm of our kind in North America. This is it. This is all we do. Dental office leases. From that, we've been a proud partner of Schein's now, and one Schein for the past decade now almost. And we've got 27 years in the business, and we've done over 12,000 successful lease negotiations. From that, lots of CE courses. We're going to be back as one of the panelists at the upcoming Yankee, so great to get back into a level of normalcy. And we're pretty unique, right? We've got an in-house lease negotiation team, some of which have been with us now for over 18 years. We also have multiple commercial real estate attorneys that are doing dental office leases all day, every day. And we also have some that used to work on the dark side, those that were on the landlord side negotiating against doctors. We've now brought them on board to now help represent the doctor through the course of negotiations. So, purpose, process, and payoff for this afternoon. Number one is, right, based on your situation, is now the time to make the change? Is now the time to think about expanding, relocating, renegotiating the practice? And we're going to touch on that in a case study path. Then from that is to think about what are other components of the lease that might have a significant impact, right? What are some of the risks involved? And how do I help to weigh those risks as I'm contemplating, should I hunker down and stay, or should I contemplate, right, what that landlord down the street may be willing to do? And then also really getting into the top tips and tricks and strategies on how to exceed and succeed in your next lease negotiation. All right, so next up, we've got some great examples where doctors came to us with exactly these types of challenges. So we thought we'd share the first one from Boston. Matthew, you want to give a little background on the situation for the doctor?
Yeah, certainly. So as Eric mentioned, we had a doctor. She was located in Boston, Massachusetts. They were in their mid-career, and really what happened here was a renewal or planned renewal that turned into a relocation. This doctor, unfortunately, was being forced to relocate from the basement of their current building because the landlord was undergoing some major renovations, and then decided that they needed the doctor's space back from them. To make matters worse, on top of that, they also had no options to renew the lease. So while we were in the process of negotiating the lease, we actually negotiated 2 others before settling on the final new location.
Yeah, so just to add a little bit to that is, some of you may be in a similar situation, hopefully not this dire, But don't forget, you got a 1,000, 1,500, 2,000 square foot box. The landlord, obviously, the bigger the box, the more leverage. So if you've got a big anchor tenant that's looking to take over more space, the landlord will be the first to push you aside, right, to appease that larger tenant. Larger tenant is paying more of their overhead and their expenses. So that's a key piece. So the doctor had an option to say, look, what happens if we stayed, right, and renegotiated and just stayed within the same building? Or what if, right, we sort of had our cake and eat it too. What if we were able to put the fishing rod in the water just to see what that landlord down the street would do? So Kelly, one of our lease negotiators, took on the file and started working closely with the doctor. And through the process, what we started to do is look at the availability. What was coming up in the area? What were things that were comparable? What were some things that, were offering commissions to brokers, which ones weren't, right? And which were some of the well sought after locations? And it was interesting. There was a location just up the road, beautiful new building, right? Didn't have as many tenancy, got hit pretty hard with a lot of retail focus through COVID. And we reached out to the landlord to say, hey, look, we've got an existing dentist, right, with X amount of new patients that's contemplating a relocation to a different, to a location close by, right? What would you be willing to do? So through the process, and this was over a number of months, but to frame what that looks like, here's the tangible results. So ultimately, we were able to achieve roughly $316,000 in total savings. So, right, how can you do this? Well, it was broken down through some of the 7 main financial variables: base rent, annual increase, common area maintenance, fixturing, free rent, tenant improvement allowance, and landlord work. So the way to approach these is, again, don't underestimate the value you have in your upcoming negotiation. And as much as we think, oh my God, the last thing I'd want to do is relocate, it might be one of the best things you've done. And a number of our clients in Vermont, for example, would go back and do it again 100 times because it was the best thing for their practice. Build it out just the way you want, right? Design it around the patient flow you have, helping to make sure that it's exactly the way you'd want it set up, right-handed, left-handed, etc., and make sure that's key. But part of this was, right, what were the landlords going to do to entice, right, the landlord to come on board and the doctor to come on board? And what came back was $284,000 of tenant improvement allowance, basically meaning that the landlord was willing to incur and cover the vast majority of the build-out expenses to help. Again, they just wanted that medical dental because you, as a group, represent some of the highest valued tenants on the planet. You have the highest build-out costs of any other commercial real estate tenant, right, at $150, $200, $250 per square foot. For those right now in San Francisco, it's upwards of $400 per square foot. It's astonishing. Number 2 is the default rate. Your default rates are 0.5%. It's negligible. And of course, more recently, you have been shown to be COVID proof, right? There's not one dentist that's been able to work from home. So therefore, what a great opportunity now to leverage that fact and use that. And that's exactly what we saw here. So not only did we get almost $300,000 worth of tenant improvement, money from the landlord to cover the build-out costs, but also to help minimize upfront expenses, was over $33,000 in free rent. In addition to that, right, also we were able to, because of global shortages, et cetera, 6 months worth of free rent, basically referred to as a fixturing period. So from the time you get your keys to the time that you're open, that is the time known as fixturing, not free rent. Free rent is after commencement, right? Fixturing is the beforehand. So we were able to secure up to 6 months or up until the time that, right, they were open, and as well as the $33,000 worth of free rent. In addition to that, this was going to be the long-term home, and this initial lease was going to be the governing document when she was going to sell, right? So therefore, we made the options transferable. So for those of you, again, with your leases up, look in your option to renew section. Do you have the option to transfer that over to, right, your purchaser? or are they only good for you? Are they only personal to you? And that can be a big issue, right? If you go to sell and suddenly the buyer can't get a loan because the option to renew is only good for you, and now suddenly there's only 2 years left on the lease, right? It's almost impossible for that buyer to get a loan from the bank, right? So bottom line, in addition to that, dramatically improved even the liabilities on the lease. And in this case, her previous location is that after she sold the practice, she would still remain continually liable. And this might come as a shock to many of you, but yes, even after you sell your practice, you go into retirement, the vast majority you will remain continually liable even after the sale. So this was a perfect opportunity to move down the street, start fresh. And now she knows that when she sells, she'll be absolved of that continuing liability and helping to limit the personal guarantee, right? Which is another component that a lot of doctors are concerned about with a relocation is, well, hey, what does that new lease negotiation look like? Is it worse or better for me? And last but not least, we also remove the right to the landlord to be entitled to a percentage of the practice sale proceeds, right? Meaning that the landlord was entitled to a percentage of whatever they were to sell. And we saw an example of this recently. A doctor who sold his practice to a corporation was in a strip mall that was up for redevelopment, and the landlord refused to assign the lease and transfer it from the seller to the corporate buyer. And in the end, to facilitate a $2 million sale, that doctor wrote a check to the landlord for $160,000 just for signing the one piece of paper, assigning the lease from themselves, right, to the corporate buyer. Also on that, lots of others to help to make sure there was no requirement to return it to pre-dental condition, right? We then helped to dramatically improve the security deposit options. There was no radius of restrictions, and we made sure there was not any relocation or demolition rights for the doctor. So great example. She rated us a great review that really sort of walked us through the process as to what we did based on what happened with a fire that was in the building, how we helped to adjust, and really how we were able to source a different location and quickly find out which landlord was going to be doing the most for us to really earn and attract our business, right? And again, lots of great examples here with that $283,950 of tenant improvement allowance, but who's counting? Okay. Again, from the chat perspective, guys, write out what would you do in these types of situations. So you've got the chat, pull that open, and happy to share some of those as we go. All right, Mr. Donato.
Yeah, certainly. So the next doctor that we have here, doctor in Pinole, California, really what they were looking at doing here, she was ready to retire, ready to transition out of the practice. And unfortunately, what ended up having to happen was a forced relocation due to the arduous assignment language. So Dr. N, she was 74 years of age and was unfortunately forced to relocate their practice to a nearby location after trying to sell the practice on 3 separate occasions. Now, really what happened here was every time that they had approached the landlord to sell, the landlord just kept saying no. Based on the assignment clause, no. Based on the assignment clause, no. And that happened, like I said, 3 separate occasions. And many of you that are following along with your lease agreements today, important to note out, what does your assignment clause say about your capability to actually sell your practice, right? And as mentioned, 3 separate times the landlord can just say no. So what ends up having to happen is a relocation. Eric, why don't you walk us through some of the strategy on how we approach that?
Yeah, thanks, Matt. Devastating situation. Again, what would you do? You're at your end of your career. You've now, you've built up. This doctor was about about $750,000 worth of annual production, right? A sizable amount. Certainly nothing you wanted to walk away from. And then suddenly, the landlord was also one of the other tenants in the strip mall and wanted her end cap space. And the landlord had whatever control they wanted to say yes or unreasonably say no. So again, you are now, right, 74 years of age, kids, grandkids, etc. And suddenly now you've got a buyer, practice brokers, etc. tried to sell it to all the different elements, and each time the landlord come back and said no. What would you do? Right? Who would you call? Right? So as we're thinking about this, right, what does that look like? And what can you do to be proactive for that? So the strategy here was a few fold. Number one is, right, if we cannot stay, then why continue, right? Why delay the inevitable? And unfortunately, we got to the point where the landlord just refused. And therefore, yes, right, at 74 years of age, we relocated the doctor about 10 minutes north. And, right, knowing the situation, we were able to structure in a way to minimize the impact, right, to get a full build out done and get it all done by the landlord and the landlord's contractors. So what happened here? Bottom line is we were able to help source a new location, to help secure a new build out as part of what's called landlord work, which is their responsibility to you to help whatever that may be, put in phase 2 electrical, make sure it's a full inch instead of a half-inch water pipe, right? To make sure all the compressors, hand pieces, and everything else work appropriately. In addition to that, we were able to help make sure that with the very challenging landlord she had, was to make sure that there was not a fee, a departure fee, right? Basically to restore it to pre-dental condition. As you can imagine, the landlord wanted to move in. Who do you think they would rather pay? You on the way out, right? Or themselves to incur that additional demolition to remove all the, right, plumbing, electrical, etc., right, to move their restaurant into. So that was a huge component. Number two was we were able to get the landlord to cover 100% of those build out costs. Does it happen every day? Of course not, right? But based on that terrible situation, it was a perfect location that this other mall was desperate to bring in a medical dental, and really were willing to do whatever it took to help ensure that they brought in the right medical dental mix. In addition to that, liability we touched on before. So of course, right, the last thing the doctor wanted to have was to sell it, yet still be on the hook for a 9-year lease. So what was more important, we were able to remove that continuing liability post-sale, as well as considering we were uni-focused on facilitating the sale, that we remove the landlord's right to that percentage of practice sale proceeds. So again, for those of you that are closer to transitioning, right, your priorities are pretty straightforward. How do you minimize liability? How do you minimize personal guarantee? How do you help to limit or remove liability after the sale, right? Continuing liability, not only for rent, but everything else within the lease also becomes your responsibility, even after you sell and you've walked away from your practice, right? So really from those components are key, as well as the assignment. That assignment section is arguably one of the most important section that it could impact 100% of those practice sale proceeds. Also, we were able to modify the relocation and the demolition clause to make sure that the new buyer would be able to get, right, a loan and have sufficient continuity and predictability of revenue. And as a nice little cherry on top at the end, we were able to get exclusivity to make sure that they, even though the landlord built them out, right, they were able to be the only general dentist in the entire mall. Good. Feel free to throw in some of the additional questions as we go. And again, let's look at some others. So here's, again, the great example. We were really able to get out of a very difficult situation, right? And being able to get her into a new spot and results. And one of our attorneys, Cameron, did a fantastic job to get everything done from start to finish. Okay. Mr. Donato.
Yeah, certainly. So the next situation here, it was a doctor in Corona, California, another situation, mid-career, really looking at how to build their practice, how to grow and expand here. So Dr. W ran a very successful practice along with her husband, who was a former corporate lawyer. Now, despite their knowledge of law and leasing and so forth, they decided to work with us, a dental-specific lease negotiator, to maximize the success of their lease renewal and expansion. So really the situation we were dealing with here was they were outgrowing their space. They were ready to see, what the horizons look like if they were to expand. And they utilized us in that negotiation to ensure that they were getting the most out of their new space and ensuring that they were protected all the way through while taking on more space, more rent, and a little bit more exposure as well.
Yeah, so these are always interesting, especially when a family member is an attorney or otherwise. Um, what's specific here is it's a good point, is talking about assembling your professional team. And you've got choices, right? You could have brother-in-law as I do, who's an electrician. You could have a designer, an architect that does all sorts of great types of buildings, etc. But as you'll start to see, especially for those that you've already done a build it before, the uniqueness of a dental practice is incredibly unique. And it becomes very important to have a hyper specialized team that you might have a lawyer in the family, wife, spouse, husband, etc. But, right, how many leases have they been involved? Right? Where is the data coming from in terms of rental rates, vacancies, et cetera, to help properly negotiate some of these components at the very early onset, all the way through in a lease letter of intent? So, yeah, this was a unique one where it was hey, what about how do we help to figure out a renewal? And maybe we don't have to relocate. What can we do to really help with the expansion? Well, as a result, pretty interestingly, there was a tenant next door. Well, lo and behold, due to the impact of COVID, et cetera, that tenant next door had been a little behind in rent. And that landlord was actually very open to relocating, right, that dry cleaner to a whole different section, or even I can't recall if they relocated them or just had them out, but they would much prefer to have one of their larger, right, medical dental practices expand into that adjacent suite. So end results were we were able to get a 15 times return on investment. This is a mid-career doctor, right, focusing on should I renegotiate or should I relocate? And we were able to get the best of both worlds. We were able to move and take over that very coveted space next door, which technically was unavailable. But through conversations with the landlord, etc., they were very willing to appease the dental tenant. And yeah, we were able to get a 15 times return on investment, and additional tenant improvement allowance, and helping to decrease the rent payments. So this is what we call the blend and extend technique. Blend and extend. I'll add that to the notes here. Blend and extend. So from that perspective, what that means is you're in your location, you've got 2,000 square feet, you want to take over another 1,000 square feet, right? You might be 2 years into a 10-year term. So what a nice opportunity to say, hey, let's extend the lease, right? Let's blend it into the adjacent suite and let's extend it for another 10-year term. So now suddenly you can either get one continuous lease now for the next 10 years, right? And you can get the benefit now because you're not just one tenant in one unit, right? You've now got two units, right? And can combine that into one, more economies of scale, more benefits, etc. So as a result, of course, here as well, we also remove those continuing liabilities, landlord's right to proceeds, remove the demolition clause, right? Because what's the point in building at a beautiful new location if the landlord 2 years later can demolish it? We also then added a lot of term options. We extended the use clause so they not only can do the general dentistry services they were doing, but also expanded and broadened it so they can do more spa types treatments. They can also be doing things like Botox or otherwise. And a lot of doctors will be surprised to know that, well, what do you mean? I do endo, ortho, perio, prost, etc. But you'll be shocked to know that depending on your lease, you could be limited to that scope. And what we've seen a lot of is doctors, especially specialists, that are then negotiating for exclusivity to be the only one to be providing orthodontic services in the mall, right? And depending on what's structured in the lease, that can dramatically impact, right, especially with Invisalign or otherwise, of what you're doing and generating on a daily basis. So blend and extend. It's a great one. Landlords love it because they're getting the ability to get the best of both worlds. They're getting a tenant that's extending, right? As well now as they can now recognize more revenue as it's now extended over the next 10 plus years. Okay, blend and extend. All right, next up, Mr. Donato. Here was the example. Here was a great example from the doctor. Again, one of our attorneys were able to get 15 times, almost $170,000 worth of return, and really helping to make sure that it's well prepared for the sale. All right, no more California, Matt.
Yeah, this is an interesting one. This is a doctor in West Des Moines, Iowa. They're mid-career orthodontist, and really the goal of our project here was to renew and remodel the space. Now, what ended up happening with this doctor was that they had a number of issues with the space itself. The landlord continued to change hands, and that caused some issues with some of the upkeep, common area maintenance, things of that nature. But all in all, when acquiring his space as well, it was beginning to get a little run down. So he was looking at ensuring that we could negotiate a long-term deal in the current space, and in return get some incentivization from the landlord, potentially to help with the build out, or he was willing to finance himself as well, just to ensure that the office was up to date. Now, as I mentioned, the building where he was located, there was a number of changes in ownership. There was a lot of turnover there, and really what he was trying to do was clean up the deal. He had a number of arduous clauses within the lease before investing a great deal of money into the space to make it his long-term home. Now, what ended up occurring that, through the project, while we were looking at the current location and, as mentioned, making that long-term extension to the lease, a couple of vacancies actually popped up around the area. And what he decided to do was go forth and explore those in great detail, to see if he could take advantage of the leasing market in the area, due to some of the increased availabilities, as mentioned, due to COVID, and move to a new location. So it was a big shift in events, walking in thinking, let's renew, let's make this the long-term home. But looking elsewhere, you can find a lot of these opportunities that may be the better move or long-term move for the practice.
Yeah, so let's dig into that a little bit. So, either a show of hands or a little emojis or otherwise, how many of you are thinking about making an investment into your current practice? Let that be a renovation. Let that be, changing flooring, paint, adding some equipment, etc. Right? You can raise your hands or a little thumbs up through there. Yeah, there we go. Okay. So, for those of you that are thinking of making those specific updates and changes, what you want to think about first is the lease. And it might be the last thing on your mind. But let's think it through a little bit. So here's a doctor in Des Moines, Iowa, where thinking about a considerable investment into the practice. And I've got another active file on my desk right now where the doctor's on the threshold of making a over $300,000 investment into the space, right? A bunch of upgrades, both on the equipment, but as well as flooring, paint, redoing the reception area, really making the sterilization area, bringing it up to current standards, etc., and doing a lot more to help ensure that they're up to standards. What's unique is, right, first of all, think about the landlord and how they may actually be willing even to help subsidize those costs or help pay for some of that. Wouldn't that be nice if the landlord's actually going to help you cover the cost? But it's making their building more attractive. It's increasing the value of their building. So that's the positive side. The negative side is what a lot of doctors don't realize is that they're 3 years into a 5-year term, and okay, great. Now I've got a great deal. Schein's giving me some great equipment. I can get some beautiful 8-deck chairs, even though inventory is a little challenging right now, right? We're going to line everything up, and suddenly, great. I'm going to do the renovations. I'm going to get the landlord's approval. But then what they fail to remember is what happens if, right, in a few months from now or a few years from now, when the lease is coming up for renewal, and you say, okay, great, time to renegotiate. Boy, I think that rent is pretty high. What do you think the landlord's going to do? They're going to say, great, you just invested $300,000. Fantastic. Here's a 20% increase in rent. So now you've not only made the major investment without getting any help from the landlord, but you missed that opportunity to renegotiate, right? So much better, even if you're 3 years out, even if you're 4 years out, heck, even if you're 9 years out, it's much better to engage the landlord to say, look, right, I want to stay. I want to find a long-term solution. But if the lease isn't at least fair, we're not talking about something that's out of left field. But if the lease is at least not fair, then you know what? I got to find alternatives, because there's no way I'm going to invest $300,000 if I've got a lease that's going to expire in the next 3 years and I don't have sufficient term and options. Why would anybody do that? Right. So really make sure that you've got a long-term security in place and leverage the fact if you're making a major investment. So really, so what occurred here? So first of all, this was a unique piece where everything happened quite quickly. And actually, it was a bit of if you remember from college and cramming for exams, this was one that, again, one of our attorneys did within about a 48-hour period. This is not status quo, but it was when everything lined up. We needed to get things resolved quickly, and we were able to get a few things. Number one was we were able to get incredibly fair terms on rent and these major lease components negotiated, where uniquely we had a very open landlord that, in exchange of commitment, investments, etc., was agreeable to almost everything we proposed, right? The dozens and dozens of clauses was almost in complete alignment. Fantastic, right? Also, of course, no right to sale proceeds and the release of liability after the sale. We remove the personal guarantee. And for those of you that may not be aware of what the personal guarantee is, very common that landlords will require you to, no different than a loan, add that personal guarantee or indemnification, which basically means in the event of any dispute or any missed payments or any of the performance of the lease, any issues within the lease, damages, etc., the landlord could go after your corporation, or depending on how it's structured, and then onto yourself and any of your personal assets. So personal guarantee is something that can be scary, but it can also be negotiated. It shouldn't have to be forever and ever. Amen. So we were able to get that release of liability, exclusivity, term, and options. Okay, so appreciate all the hand raises. Another quick one, Matt.
Yeah, so doctor in Placentia, California, mid-career doctor. The goal coming into this was an expansion in long-term security. So this doctor, remember this very vividly, they've been practicing for 13 years in this space. And at that point, they were saying, we had a conversation a couple of years before. Now they were getting ready to outgrow that space. They were really about to bust at the seams. And fortunately, the adjacent unit became vacant. So he had approached us and said, I really, really want to expand into that adjacent unit. I want to see what that looks like. Let's see what the landlord is willing to propose, because this is going to take my practice to the next level. Now, with the current lease in place, it was expiring in about 3 years' time. And keeping in mind there was always the cost of the office remodel and of the expansion. They had approached us to help negotiate a long-term lease so that they had that security. Also to see, what was the landlord willing to give in terms of that expansion? What were some of those inducements to take on more space? But also, they wanted to ensure that the lease was properly structured so that after this expansion, they didn't have to think about the lease agreement again. It was properly structured for the remainder of their career and for an easy transition to any future buyers.
Yeah, so really the strategy and the approach here was this, right? 13 years, finally paying off some student loans, right? And then contemplating the next steps. Should I relocate, or, right, boy, I could save myself a ton of build-out costs if at least I could move into the adjacent suite. So part of the thing for all of you taking notes is the ROFR, right? The right of first refusal. I'll add that to the notes as well, right? What is a ROFR? Feel free to throw that in the notes, right? What does that mean? How does it work? Well, it ultimately is an option for you that if in the event the adjacent suite becomes available or however it's structured, you then have the right to move in first. So that's helpful, first of all, to realize if another competing doctor is moving in next door, right? Or it at least gives you that ability to be at the table and make the best decision based on the time that it crops up. So that's nice to make sure that, whoops, there's not a surprise. I only wish I knew before that florist moved in next door. I would have loved to have taken that over. Now they signed a 10-year lease and now I'm stuck. Now I have to relocate and incur all these additional expenses, right? That we didn't want. So as an end result here, we're able to secure a very good long-term lease. Now that we were extending, we don't want to go anywhere, right? And then we were able to get 4 5-year options. So really for this doctor, this is their home. They love the location. They love the mall. They've now got the perfect square footage. And we were able to secure 32 years worth of term and runway, not only for themselves, but also very helpful for their future buyer. It was everything the doctor wanted. They were overjoyed, right? And they didn't have to go through the relocation process, right? We maximized the help to put a protective force field around those eventual practice sale proceeds, and now got them set up really for the life of their practice and when they eventually look to transition. Okay, Matthew, I think this is the last one before we get into some good practical examples here.
Correct. Yeah. This is a doctor in Fremont, California. Once again, they were in mid-career, looking to see how to create a long-term lease for themselves, give themselves that runway through the rest of their career. But ultimately, the goal here was to relocate. I mean, this doctor came to us with one of the worst leases that we had ever seen. I mean, it was completely in the landlord's favor. Everything from proceeds of sale, termination rights, and so on and so forth. Unfortunately, it was just really leaving the doctor completely exposed to costly traps that could have easily cost him hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars.
Yeah, this was a referral, I believe, from one of the executives of a family member of one of the family of the executives at Schein, and you wouldn't even believe it if you saw it. There was a $100,000 construction supervision fee within the lease. When on God's green earth have you seen a $100,000 construction supervision fee? Obviously the liability piece after the sale, rent remains, right? The same for the new tenants, they can't change it. Sale proceeds, right of first refusal or first offer, and the tenant improvement allowance, and the transferability of options. So again, through all of these different examples, hopefully you found it helpful to put yourself in the doctor's shoes and what happens if. And if there's one thing that COVID taught us is that all the things we never thought would happen to us in our lives, global shutdowns, pandemics, etc., have. So now how do we help to protect ourselves? And one other component, regardless of where you're at, is something called a death and disability clause. I'll add that into the notes as well. Right? And this is dental specific. A death and disability clause is something I cannot stress enough for each and every one of you. Let it be buying, relocating, etc. Matthew, do you want to touch on a little bit about what that is and why that's so important?
Yeah, essentially, one way to think about the death and disability clause, it's almost like a life insurance policy that we write into the lease agreement, right? And essentially, what it does for you is that God forbid anything is to happen to any one of you, whether it's a physical injury, any form of mental incapacitation to the point where you're no longer able to practice dentistry, or worst case scenario, you are to pass away. It gives yourself or your estate the right to either A, terminate that lease agreement, or B, sell the practice on looser transition provisions, right? This way, we're just ensuring that no matter what happens to any of you, yourself, your family, your estate, everyone is all protected, right? The lease agreement is binding to all of your successors and heirs. So if something is to happen to you, the next of kin, your spouse or otherwise, does have the responsibility of paying for that lease agreement. I mean, we had a doctor just north of us here that unfortunately, 42 years of age, 2 weeks prior to the grand opening of his brand new dental practice, he had a heart attack and passed away. And well, now you have the wife and his 18-year-old son at the time, both held on the hook for the lease agreement for the next 10 years at $7,000 a month, increasing at 3% year over year. Right. So absolutely devastating. I mean, now you have a fully built out practice, no doctor, no patients. What's that practice worth? Right. Unfortunately, it's worth nothing. So, the reason that we get so passionate about what we do here is that in that situation, if something such as a death and disability clause had been in the lease agreement, we could have completely circumvented that issue.
Yeah. So again, for those of you taking notes, I added that into there. It in essence, lower back pain, hand tremors, carpal tunnel, etc. You might not be physically disabled, but you're sure not operating at the same level you were, same hand speed, etc., or potentially at all. My godfather, right, had cartilage issues, took a divot the wrong way, and you know what, just couldn't hold his elbow up at the proper angle. Right? And then unfortunately, after further digging, right, and going into surgery, he could never practice again. So these are the type of things that you just want to have as many extra protections. Termination rights are fantastic to help you. Okay, so from that perspective, relocations. So now, as we're thinking about these, let's say we are thinking about relocating, and in the new lease, there is a relocation clause. So, Matthew, you want to talk a little bit about what the relocation right is for the landlord and what that means for the doctor?
Yeah, so the relocation clause, essentially what it is, and as you can see there, it's an option granted to the landlord about giving them the ability to move the premises essentially whenever they feel like it. Now, a well-written relocation clause can protect the tenant and save you from expenses. But in most cases, it's not written that way. More often than not, you're going to see a relocation clause that gives you very little notice period. It could be out of your space within 60 days, and the landlord can move you anywhere else into the building. In some cases, for any of you on this evening's course that are in a complex or a building complex or a compound, I had a doctor of mine that was moved from the front corner unit and was then put all the way at the back corner in the rear parking lot, completely eliminating all visibility from them. So, the relocation clause, if not written correctly or if in the lease at all, can definitely impact not only your visibility but also patient attrition rates and see shutdowns for unforeseen periods of time. And more importantly, a lot of the time when you're looking at selling the practice, any of your practice valuations that you may be undergoing today, if you do have a relocation clause in the lease, this can greatly diminish the value of your practice. Eric, you had a specific example of that recently.
Yeah, there's a few here that's key. First of all, one of our team members that came from the landlord side. Uh, and these are examples we hear of all the time, but this was an example where there was a tenant in that location for roughly about 2,500 square feet. Yet on that floor was a much larger entity. Uh, what ended up happening was the landlord engaged with that tenant, and that was a nice sort of ground floor type of location, lots of natural light, right? Nice location. And the tenant then went through and said, "Okay, great, it's my annual renewal. How much? That's a little high. Would have been a little bit lower. Okay, great, and sign my another 5 years and go back to work." Not knowing that in the background, the landlord had already signed for the entire floor and now exercise the relocation right the day after they renewed their lease. The doctor renewed their lease, and then they signed right them up for that ground floor location. They relocated them down to the basement at the ground floor rates. So that poor tenant relocated right to the basement, lost the natural light, lost ground floor, paying all those rates, right? And right, the tenant, the bigger tenant, right, the anchor, took over the entire floor, and the landlord won on both accounts. So the relocation clause, this might make you sick to your stomachs, But this is something that you really need to look out for. And this can be hidden in a whole bunch of different sections. Sections 84, subsection C, right? But in essence, this gives the landlord the right to relocate you. And a doctor I recently did the lease renewal and lease negotiation for recently, it said good news, right? The landlord will cover up to 100% of the cost for you to move from, right, suite A to suite C, right, with a maximum of up to 2 months worth of base rent. I can hear the anger in the background, right? So think about that. You've now, the landlord moves you with as little as 60 days notice, and they'll only cover 10,000 bucks or 2 months worth of base rent. Yet it's going to force you to pay for, right, an additional 200 bucks per square foot of build up. Right? This could be devastating, especially towards the end of your careers. So these are the type of things to be aware of and to help protect yourself from. And there's lots of ways of doing it. But also think about it. If you get moved, if it's a different layout, let's say it's a pie shape, and suddenly now, can you fit in your 5 operatories? No, right? If it's a larger location, that means increase in rent, right? So it either means less operatories, less production, or larger space, more rent. Right? So these are the things to be keenly aware of, especially as you're contemplating next steps. So as we wrap up here, a couple of final components are, look at this language. So this is what in many leases we see today, this is what the landlord puts in their standard form lease as it pertains to the relocation. So number one, the landlord may at any time upon 60 days notice relocate the premises to premises reasonably comparable in size. The tenant will reopen for business to the public in the new premises to the date set out by the landlord's notice of relocation. So, guys, as you've read that, what do you think the red flag is here? Right? The landlord now sets the date of when you will reopen. That could be a month later, 2 months later, 3 months later, 6 months later, right? You've lost the ability and then your lights out. And you know what? It's not even the loss of production. It's the patient attrition that when your lights out, right, we've seen upwards of 8% per month of when patients go down the hall, down the street, never come back. What else do you see for issues here? As we read through, how about this? Right now, suddenly, as I mentioned before, your rent is now going to be adjusted. You could be paying even more, right, based on the gross leasable area for the new premises. Right? So your rent might be even going up. Not only are you having to incur all these upfront expenses, but now you've also got to deal with the increased rent. Right? And last but not least, the kicker, and this is in almost each of these relocation clauses. Let's say you say, you know what, Mr. Landlord, no, you know what, I'm happy where I am. Well, good news. If you object to the relocation or, right, that basement location that they relocated you to, right, the landlord can then say, okay, good, right, here's 60 days notice and we're terminating your lease, right, in this case 30 days notice. So now not only are you not forced to move to a different spot within the building, now you're forced to find a new home within the next 30 days, which of course is virtually impossible. One single clause, right, just 3 of the red flags of many others, right, that should be completely rewritten, right, to make sure that, number one, if they are to relocate you, it should be things like a lights off to a lights on, meaning that the new practice is up and built, ready to go. So on Friday afternoon, you turn off the lights, the movers over the weekend moves you through, Henry Schein gets all the new equipment in and set up, and Monday morning you're up and running like there's without missing a beat. Right? These are the components, as well as to make sure that the landlord is going to be keenly responsible for whatever those relocation costs are. As you can imagine, the cost of this mistake can be astronomical, right? And the price per square foot to restore the current space back to pre-dental condition could be considerable, right? Downtime, patient attrition, less desirable space, right? Less natural light, etc. I mean, just rough math on the napkin could easily be $750,000. So that's just one example, right? And for all of you, this evening, this is just one example of these. This is a great one to look at. because each of these sections are negotiable and you should be keenly aware of. And if you're not sure, then definitely make sure in a moment, we'll have a quick option to do a customized review of your lease to make sure at least you know what's in there, to make sure that nothing's hidden, to make sure that, oh, I'm sure, Eric, I'm sure there isn't a relocation clause, right? Yet hidden under miscellaneous terms, a landlord could position it a whole bunch of different ways. So these are just some. Does the landlord have access to your financial statements, right? Are you still in default if the landlord asked for that through the process of the recent renewal negotiation is a big one. So what's the solution here? So, Matthew, do you want to walk through best practices over the past 27 years and how doctors can help to avoid some of the pitfalls and the major mistakes and to do the next negotiation to the best of the success?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, so this is our process to success, as Eric was mentioning. This is really how we've been so successful through our negotiations over the past 27 years. Now the first step here is we want to gather all of the information, right? We want to know who the landlord is. We want to know what your situation is. What are the lease documents? What is some of the strategy here? Next, we want to move into part two. And now that's identifying your practice and career goals. So, where do you see yourself in 5 to 10 years' time? Are you looking at transitioning? Are you looking at expanding the practice? Do you need a bigger space? Do you maybe want to own your own real estate? All these different components need to be discussed. And really, so we have a key understanding, and you have a key understanding of where you really want to be, right? Then moving to the next step is reviewing the office lease for risks. So part of what Eric had mentioned, making sure that we're going through that lease agreement with a fine-tooth comb. We don't just want to look at, the first page, how much rent are we paying and how long is the term. We need to go beneath that, right? Is there a relocation clause in the lease? What does your abilities look like to sell the practice when you're ready? Is there demolition clauses and so on and so forth? All of those different arduous clauses that Eric had mentioned. Right. So
Just to add for a quick moment, really the first is part of the PPP or otherwise. If you don't have a fully executed copy of your lease, meaning that you've signed it and your landlord signed it, don't let me be the first to tell you that that isn't worth the paper it's written on. It has to be countersigned and signed by both. So if you don't have a digital copy of your lease, or you bought the practice and maybe you even didn't get a copy of the lease when you bought it, the best thing is to quickly email the landlord and to say, hey, per my year end and taxes or otherwise, can you please send me a digital version of my lease, as well as any addendums, exhibits, etc. And usually one of the admins, the landlords, will be able to send you a digital copy back shortly that's countersigned by both. It's the easiest way to make sure you know exactly not only what your last renewal was, but what that governing lease was back in 1986. Even though the practice has been sold 4 times, it's that 1986 lease is going to govern, right, your entire transaction, let it be sale or your entire performance of the lease and your entire your entire time in the space.
yeah, certainly that's a key component for sure. And that's all part of reviewing the lease, making sure that we know what the risks are.
So really, as we go through, be prepared, right? The one thing not to do is after the end of this to say, okay, great. Eric told me to pick up the phone and call the landlord and skip sections 1 all the way through section 6. Best to have a full plan, layout, negotiating the business clauses, negotiating the financials, right? And not stopping until you get a final form lease that you're satisfied with. In the essence of time, as we wrap up and go to some Q&A here, again, an appreciation of everyone's time who's attended and registered. Over the next 30 days, we're willing to waive, thank you to Schein, to waive the fee for a complimentary lease review and risk analysis. So we'll pull up a quick poll here to make it easy to facilitate that. What we'll do is have our team go through, pull up all those local real estate market reports. We'll also then, book some time, spend usually 3 to 4 hours analyzing the lease, reading it cover to cover, helping to analyze it. No, you don't have to read it through to cover. That's what our team does. And then we'll schedule a time, about an hour, where we can go through and specifically see what issues may be in your lease, right? Or even for those of you without a lease, right? Book some time to talk about what are you looking for, right? Are you looking to buy or build? Or even for those of you that own your own locations, specifically, do you have a lease that separates your corporation that owns the building from the corporation that owns the practice? So the poll's up there for a quick moment, and we'll open up to some Q&A questions. So we can use now the Q&A function, as well as I believe there's been some notes sent through here. So Matthew, one particular question here is, right, at what stage in your career is it best to relocate and purchase your own building? What the old should I buy or lease? And at what stage should I do it? Matthew, how would you address that for Dr. K?
Yeah, so a couple things with that, Dr. K. I mean, there's a multitude of considerations that need to be made alongside that question. Timing, generally speaking, the sooner, if you're more of a mid-career, that's usually the better time to take a look at saying, is it time for me to buy a building? You don't want to be in a position where you're near the end of your career and you only have, let's say, another 5 years, but now you're going to shell out the investment of buying property, putting forth, and then building out the building, and then leaving yourself very limited time to recoup that investment. Now that's sort of part one to that. The second aspect that I always, this is one of the most common questions that I receive on a daily basis is, I want to own my own real estate. And well, in principle, it's a great idea. There are a number of different aspects that unfortunately are overlooked a multitude of times. Now, first of all, you need to ascertain, are you looking at having a single tenancy standalone building? Is it only going to be you? Are you looking at having more of an investment property where it's you and a couple other tenants? Well, the next question with that is, are you ready to have other tenants? What does that look like, and how does that impact your day-to-day operations of the practice? I mean, I had a doctor of mine that had another another tenant rather, walk into his practice with a plunger in his hand, saying, "The toilets are down. I need you to fix it." So, that's a key component there. The next aspect as well is, what does your ultimate transition goal look like? Are you looking at retaining ownership of the building post sale of the practice, or are you looking at trying to sell both outright? Now, unfortunately, most new buyers aren't willing or have the financial appetite to buy both at once. But at the same time, staying on as the landlord while you're going or entering into that retirement phase, what level of involvement do you want to have? Is that how you see your retirement going? So what I would suggest, Dr. K, is the more that we can have a more in-depth conversation about that and speak one-on-one, that's definitely a great way to get a good understanding of some of that component as well, and what that actually looks like for you.
Yeah, so hopefully, Dr. K, that helps to answer your question. Another one from an anonymous doctor. Would the inability to assign a lease be a deal breaker clause for a dentist in a new lease negotiation? So if I understand that correctly, you're referring to the assignment clause, of which right within the lease, it states that the tenant does not have the ability to assign the lease, which usually, for those of you that have not bought or sold the practice before, usually that's one of the conditions of sale, right? That the buyer has, right, approval for financing, as well as there's a successful assignment of the lease. So from that perspective, very quickly, it depends. A lot of doctors, quite frankly, would not feel comfortable going into and building out a whole new practice without an exit strategy, right? Just, entrepreneurship 101. What's the exit? How does it look like? What does that mean? And yes, if the landlord won't even allow you in writing to be able to sell your practice via assigning your lease, then yes, in my opinion, that would be a deal breaker. And certainly again, you're about to make a major investment. You've got all the leverage going into it. If you don't even have an exit strategy, right, incredibly risky for you. Matthew, another question here is Dr. M. Does Cirrus advise with regard to a practice that owns a building, leasing out square footage in that building? So if I'm looking to the question here, so in regards to a practice that owns a building, leasing out square footage in that building. So yes, I believe in that particular case, if you are owner occupied, so Dr. M, if you own your building or units, right, as well as owning the practice, then yes, we do, because it becomes very important, as Matthew was just briefly touching on, is to have a properly structured dental specific lease that separates, right, the corporation or your real estate corporation, right, from your practice corporation. And that those few things. One is obviously from if you saw my webinar with Bob Gray, to make sure that you've got the ability that if audited, if you're paying from one pocket to the other, it's based on fair market rates, very important. Right? In addition to that, we also want to make sure that liabilities, who's responsible for what, building versus snow removal, etc., right, versus the practice. And then of course, value of the building, value of the practice. Far easier to structure a very landlord friendly lease now, so that when you go to sell in 5, 10, 15, 20, 30 years from now, right, that then gives you the ability to say, well, hey, look, Larry, this is the lease I've had for 27 years. I'm now just assigning it over to you. Versus what a lot of doctors make the mistake with is when they own their own, well, hey, it doesn't really matter now, unless you are heaven forbid to pass away or otherwise. But I'll just figure it out when I go to sell. But now, right, a lot of lawyers, due diligence, M&A attorneys, etc., if the ink is still wet on the lease that you're just basically creating from scratch, what a major red flag. And again, if the ink is still wet, that's just a major red flag in terms of the analysis of the lease, as well as just opening up for negotiation. Well, hey, you just created this right yesterday. Let's renegotiate. It's far easier to say, look, here's the lease I've had for the past 15 years. What should I now do? So hopefully, Dr. M, that answers your question. If not, please ask us a quick follow-up if I didn't understand that properly. Okay, Dr. K. Planning for the sale of the practice and sale of the building as well. Do you play a role? So if I understand that correctly, Aaron Rarick. So in the notes here, selling and planning to sell the practice and sell the building as well, do you play a role? So yeah, not a problem. So yeah, great question. A few components. First of all, advising, right? Through any of these things, when it's outside of your day-to-day, always have a trusted advisor. That can be on an hourly basis, that can be on whatever. So in short, we're always there to help and guide you through each part of the process. But you might have this great vision of being able to sell both. But is that the best decision for you, right? Does your accountant suggest that that might be the most tax efficient strategy? Maybe it should be, as I was talking to a doctor today in Ohio, maybe it should be a lease to own, because what are the odds, or Dr. K, do you think there's a risk that the new doctor is not going to be able to get the $1 million loan to buy your practice plus another loan to buy the real estate? Right? Or would it be more likely, or would the doctor actually prefer to say, you know what? Whoa, I'm taking on even more debt. How about this? I will, right, buy your practice today, but I want a right to purchase the building after 5 or 10 years, after I really know that this is the right home and the right location for me. So again, you might be thinking of selling both together, but you might be dramatically reducing your purchasing pool. So think about some options. So in that particular case, yes, of course, we could be there to help create the lease and or negotiate with that potential tenant that's coming in that's then buying your practice and will want a lease, that's fair, of course, right? We're not coming in as a 300-pound gorilla. We're trying to make sure that it's fair for both your future buyer and yourself now as a full-time landlord, knowing full well that that new buyer, would love to own it, but it's just not financially in the cards. Dr. K, does that help to answer your question? Perfect. Okay, good. Again, happy to have a follow-up call for that. Sounds like there's a few little nuances there. There should be a little survey afterwards or an ability to connect, or you can certainly email us at info@Serious Consulting Group, as I see a few of you have done already. Perfect. God bless Adam. I usually keep him a few minutes over because there's always some great involvement and engagement. Additional
Always grateful.
questions? No joke. Any additional questions, guys, before Adam gives us the hook? All right. On that note, Mr. Sweet, thank you again, sir, for your service. I'll pass it back to you.
Great. Thanks, guys. We did record tonight's webinar, so you'll be getting that within a week or so. Feel free to email Cirrus at info@cirrusconsultinggroup.com, or you can email us webinars@henryschein.com and we'll route your question accordingly. That's all I got. Thanks for staying late. Have a great night, everyone.
Thanks, everybody. Have a
Thank
good
you.
night.